Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Mesachet Demai. We're up to Perek Dal Mishnah Vav. The Mishnah says, "Anichnas la'ir ve'eno makir adam sham." If someone enters a city and he does not know anybody in that city who is trustworthy regarding Maasrot, Amar, he says, Mikan neman, mikan me'aser. He tells the townspeople, who here is trustworthy that he only buys tithe produce? Who's here is trustworthy that he always tithes his produce? Amar lo echad, if one of the townspeople tells him, Ani, I'm trustworthy, eno neman, we do not believe him. Amar lo ishploni neman, but if this townsperson told him, go to Reuven is believed. Hareze neman, in that case, we would believe this townsperson, and the traveler would be allowed to go and buy produce from Reuven that he recommended. And the Mefarshim explained to us, this townsperson, I cannot rely on him. Why? Because since I don't know anybody in this town, I have to assume they're all Amei Aratzot, and I have to tithe any produce that they give to me. So since I cannot believe him regarding himself, I should not be allowed to believe him when he recommends Reuven. However, the Mefarshim explain, the rabbis were lenient regarding a traveler, that he can rely on the testimony of a townsperson regarding somebody else, because since most Amei Aratzot do tithe, and it's very difficult for a traveler to have to separate the Tirumat Maaser and Maaser Sheni, because he's not going to have enough food left or enough money left since he's traveling, the rabbis allow you to rely on the testimony of this townsperson on somebody else. Since he doesn't claim that he's trustworthy himself, rather he recommends somebody else, the rabbis allow you to rely on his word. The Mefarshim do point out, the Rav says, "V'dafka kishein makir adam sham." This is only if I don't know anybody in the town who's trustworthy. Aval im makir adam sham. But if I know I'm traveling and I know somebody in the city who's trustworthy, I cannot rely on anybody's word. I have to go to this trustworthy person and ask him, "Who do you recommend I buy tithe produce? Who tithes their produce here?" The Mishnah continues, Halach likach mimenu. So right now, this townsperson went to Reuven, who was recommended to him, and he bought the fruits from him because he knows it's tithe. Amar lo, he asked Reuven, Mi kan mocher yashan? Who here sells old permitted grain, which will explain what it means. Amar lo, Reuven tells him, Mi shelachcha etzli. That original person that sent you to me, that he recommended me to you, he sells yashan, old grain. Even though it looks like they're returning favors for each other and it should look suspicious, nevertheless the rabbis believe him, because since most Amei Aratzot separate Maaser from their produce, and since most Amei Aratzot are careful to only have old permitted grain, the rabbis were lenient by a traveler and they permitted him to rely on the testimonies of these people he doesn't know on each other. We can't rely on the testimonies for themselves, but we can rely on the testimonies for each other when each one recommends the other. Even though it looks suspicious, it looks like they're working together to get travelers to buy from them, nevertheless, we believe the first one, that the person he recommended for the fruits is good, and we have the second one, that the original recommender, his grain is good. Now, Rabotai, what is Kemach Yashan? What is Kemach Chadash? We might also hear these phrases a lot of times. It's a concept in the Torah. We have like this. You're not allowed to eat any grain that took root after the 16th of Nisan, until the Korban HaOmer is brought on the second day of Pesach the following year. Any grain that took root before the 16th of Nisan is permitted in consumption. However, any grain that took root after the 16th of Nisan, after the Korban was offered, you are not allowed to eat that grain until the next year's Korban. It's called Chadash, new grain that took root after the 16th of Nisan, after the Korban was offered. But any grain that took root before the 16th, before the grain was offered, the Korban HaOmer was offered, Minchat HaOmer, that's called Yashan, old grain, that's allowed in consumption. So a person has to make sure that when you have grain, you only eat Kemach Yashan, the old grain, and not Kemach Chadash, the new grain. Just like we suspect in Am Haaretz that his produce is not tied, we also midrabanan suspect that Am Haaretz's produce is Chadash, and therefore you wouldn't be allowed to have it till the following year, the 16th of Nisan. However, it's only a Chumra midrabanan. Most Amei Aratzot, we do believe, have only Yashan, and therefore in this situation, when you're a traveler, you can rely on one person's testimony regarding his friend. That is the end, Rabotai, of Mishnah Vav. Mishnah Zayin discusses now traveling merchants who help each other out. Can the townspeople rely on them? If donkey drivers who were transporting grain enter the town, so the Rav says, what would they do? They would buy produce in places where it was cheap, and they would transport it on donkeys to places where they could sell it at a higher price. They're suspected of being Amei Aratzot, whose produce is Demai, and also Chadash, new grain. So Amar Echad, if one of them said, the merchants on the donkeys, if one of them said, Sheli Chadash v'shel Chaverai Yashan, my grain is new and forbidden, my friend's grain is old and permitted, Sheli eno mitukan v'shel Chaverai mitukan, or he says, mine has not been fixed, it wasn't tied, but my friend's has been fixed, it's been tied, and you could just eat it straight. Ena ne'emanim, they are not believed, and the Mefarshim explain why. Devadai gomlim zeh zeh, because they look certainly like they're working together to help each other. So that one of them will testify in this town that his friend's produce is more reliable than his own, and then his friend will go to the next town and do the same. He'll say the other guy's produce is more reliable than his own. Therefore, their claims are not believed, because the Mefarshim point out it's very unusual for a merchant to talk down his own produce, his own merchandise, and praise his competitions. So if they do this, it's very clear that they're scheming together, that they're working together, and therefore they cannot be believed. The Mefarshim do point out that Tiferet Israel, why is this any different than the previous Mishnah when a traveler comes and two townspeople look like they're helping each other? Why don't we suspect in that case? So the Mefarshim explain, the Chachamim allow a traveler to rely on the testimony of two people, even though it looks like they're helping each other. It's specifically a leniency for travelers. They have no way of finding out who's reliable or not. But by townspeople, they can make arrangements to buy food from people that they know are trustworthy. They cannot rely on these travelers. Also, in the previous case, the first person recommended the second person for being reliable for fruits. He didn't know that he was going to get recommended back for grain. When I sent this person to Reuven for fruits, I didn't know Reuven was going to send them back to me for grain. But in the case of the donkey drivers who traveled together to sell grain, it's very likely that they're scheming to help each other out. The Mishnah concludes, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ne'emanim. Rabbi Yehuda says they are believed, even though it looks like they're working together. Rabbi Yehuda says if we do not accept their claims, if nobody's going to buy from them, they're going to stop bringing produce to the town. That's going to seriously disrupt the produce being brought, the food supply of the town. Therefore, again, since Demai is only midrabanan, the Demai prohibition is Rabbanan, most Amei Aratzot do tithe, and also most Amei Aratzot do eat kemach yashan, the old grain. The rabbis were lenient for the sake of the food supply of the town, and they permitted townspeople to buy from a donkey driver based on his friend's testimony. But the Rav says that the Tanna Kama, on the other hand, argues, he disagrees, he doesn't care, we're not concerned about the food's town supply, because they can just go to the next town and buy produce there from the suppliers who are known to be more reliable. The Halakha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. We would not believe these traveling merchants when they testify on each other. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.